5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute. I will send a little private chat. If your group chat isn't on, I'll also make a little twinkle sound with my phone at about 3 minutes as well, in case the chat disappears, because that does seem to happen sometimes. We have 4 presentations this evening, and I've also posted in the chat window, so if you haven't got that open, you should open that. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll get a little menu bar, so click on chat. And I've put in the peer review link. Please do provide feedback. All the students find that helpful. It's how one can improve one's presentations. And that should bring us pretty much to the start for this evening. Becky, if you can start loading your presentation, that would be great.
So should I just share my PowerPoint when I do share?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Yeah. Good, that's coming through. Perfect.
Can everyone see and hear everything?
I think so.
Okay, good.
So whenever you're ready, go for it.
All right. 5 o'clock my time. I'm in Mountain Time, so I'll just get going here. So good evening, everyone. My name is Becky Patton. I'm here tonight to present to you my proposal for my capstone presentation that I've been working on over the last term with my advisor, Fritz Kessler. So the title of my proposal is Predicting Locations of Common Teasel in Colorado's Public Lands. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to cover during my presentation. So I'll start off with an introduction to the plant, the common teasel, and an introduction to my project itself, some of the reasoning behind it, a quick background. We'll look at some prior studies in this area, some of the statistical methods used in a handful of different studies, and a culmination of those studies that brought us to important site characteristics that can assist us in predicting the locations of common teasel. Next, we'll move into the methodology. I'll cover my research question and my analysis. I'll talk about data, data that I found, data that I still need to find, what type of analytical methods and software I plan to use. And I'll wrap up by discussing what end results I hope to come to, and what type of an output I plan to create, where I'll present my results, how they will use those results, hopefully, and my rough outline, and then some quick citations. So moving into an introduction of the common teasel, Latin name Dipsacus fulonum. So the common teasel is native to Europe and temperate areas of Asia. It was likely introduced to North America as early as the 1700s. It was probably introduced intentionally because the flower heads, you can see those on the left and right images, when they dry out, they were actually used as a comb for wool processing, and then another use is possibly for ornamental purposes. The common teasel favors disturbed sites, such as roadsides, ditches, riparian sites, fields, meadows, pastures, pretty much anywhere that has good sunlight and not too much canopy cover. So when you think about the United States, that describes a lot of ground in the United States. When it comes to ornamental purposes for the common teasel, they're actually found a lot of times in cemeteries because these are still used in flower arrangements and bouquets and things of that sort. And they just thrive in that type of an environment. So they have actually been labeled a noxious weed in several countries because of how voraciously they spread. So within the Americas, so North America, Central, South America, countries in Southern Africa, Australia, New Zealand have all actually labeled the common teasel as a noxious weed. All right, so the common teasel is of interest to forest managers because as I mentioned, it has spread through a lot of different countries, to include North America. It has a strong potential to become an invasive species. You can see here on the right-hand side a map of teasel distribution is depicted by the Invasive Plant Atlas. However, the US Forest Service has actually stated that distribution maps often underestimate the locations of common teasel because it's a large plant. It grows to like 6 to 8 feet in height, and it's very prickly, so it doesn't get sampled a lot. So this map here on the right-hand side shows counties where common teasel has been found, but it's probably found in a lot more locations than what's depicted here. And also in areas such as the state of Washington, it has started spreading into agricultural areas, so competing with cash crops. So two agencies that have taken a particular interest in the common teasel is the US Forest Service, I'll talk more about them later on, and the National Park Service. And the Forest Service in particular has been tracking the teasel since 2009. So, so most common teasel studies in the United States have been conducted in California. There are some in Washington where it's starting to spread into agricultural areas. And there's one that has been conducted here in Colorado to date, or one published one, I should say. But the thing is that most of the studies on common teasel focus on potential biological controls. The lack of biological controls, since it's a non-native species, that's kind of the focus right now for trying to control it. But I would like to not necessarily look at biological controls and look more at predicting where we might find common teasel. So my project objectives are identifying the important site characteristics to help forest managers to predict where common teasel will grow in Colorado's public lands. So the National Forest Service is basically my customer, for lack of a better word, for this project. So that's why I'm focusing on public lands, such as national forests. And my second objective for this project will be to write a Python program because the Forest Service employees that I've been working with said that that would be incredibly helpful to them. I'm not sure if I will complete that before the conclusion of 596B, but that's the ultimate end goal of my project, even if it has to run past 596B. So I'll start off with my background research, talking about highlighting two particular studies. So there's two, I looked at probably a dozen different studies, but these are the two that are most directly relevant to my goals. So 10 years ago, there was a master's student at San Jose State University that actually conducted a very similar analysis, a very similar project. The student looked at only 5 site characteristics. So he looked at canopy cover, slope, aspect, proximity to roads, and proximity to water, and tested the significance of each of those factors to the presence of common teasel. He used multiple logistic regressions and then used weighted overlays based on known locations where common teasel has already been found. He also mentioned that human presence would likely be a factor. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but he did not include that as one of the variables in his analysis. So that's definitely something I want to add to mine. Also, 2 years ago, the Forest Service published a study on common teasel presence here in Colorado. And as I mentioned, as far as I can find, that is the only study that has been published on locations of teasel in Colorado. So this study also used logistic regression. They also used probit regression analysis, and they looked at 6 physical site characteristics. They looked at elevation, slope, aspect, precipitation, forest type, and average temperature during the growing season. They also looked at a handful of non-environmental characteristics, such as population density, and they did look at human presence in their study, and about 10 other non-physical, non-environmental characteristics, but my study is going to focus on the physical characteristics. So in addition to these two highlighted studies, there were a handful of other several other statistical methods used in previous studies. So there were some that used global Moran's eye and oftentimes combined that with an optimized hotspot analysis. They use this to determine the statistical significance of spatial autocorrelation between TESOL locations and the site characteristics that they looked at. There were a couple studies that used two different of these two-step methods. So the one two-step method looked at how proximity to roads, proximity to water, and elevation impacted presence of TESOL. And then that second two-step method is the Heckman method, also known as Heckett. And they looked at aspect and slope and found that they had that they were statistically significant to predicting locations. But interestingly enough, they actually found that proximity to water was not found to be statistically significant. So this just demonstrates that there's not necessarily agreement on which characteristics are important and impactful in assisting the prediction of where common TESOL will be found. As I mentioned, the two highlighted studies that I mentioned on the previous slide and other studies used logistic regression models. And that's what I plan to use. Logistic regression, I'll talk about more in a minute, but it answers yes/no questions basically. So is it there or is it not there? So it makes logical sense that multiple studies use logistic regressions. And logistic regressions also lend themselves to nicely making likelihood or probability maps. And that's another thing I plan to use as well. Okay. So looking through all of these studies, about a dozen studies or so, I pulled out the different site characteristics that different studies used and kind of grouped them into two different categories. So there's the environmental characteristics and then the human-related characteristics. So I'm planning to look at the majority of these. Elevation, I'll talk more about data later on. But yeah, most of these came up in several studies. Soil type was only looked at in maybe one or two. Human presence over in the human-related characteristics, that's a newer one, so that hasn't been looked at in as many of the studies as maybe it should. So I certainly am trying to find a way to incorporate that into mine. So I'll talk more about data in a minute. So this leads us to the overall research question. I'd like to answer the likelihood that common TESOL will grow in a location, in a given location related to the handful of site characteristics that I plan to look at. So this is the majority of them from the previous slide. The type of analysis I plan to use will be logistic regression models and using the outputs from those models to create probability maps that can be provided, to forest managers and other interested parties to assist them in predicting where they might find common TESOL. And my ultimate end goal is to create a Python program to build these probability maps to make it easier for forest managers to do this on their own using their own data. So I promised you we'd talk about data. So where to find data, what data will be used. The Forest Service, I've actually gotten a lot of data from them. I didn't realize that they had as much data readily available. So TESOL locations, I've actually been working with Forest Service employees to get the exact locations of where they have found this invasive species, or potentially invasive species, this non-native species. Forest boundaries, because I'm focusing on public lands. So I'm not looking necessarily at all roadways or anything like that. I'm focusing on public lands, national forests. So I was able to get forest boundaries. They have a very extensive waterways, shape files, transportation networks to include forest trails, logging roads, things of that sort. Very, very helpful. For canopy cover, that's another characteristic that was looked at in a couple. I was able to get that from the National Land Cover Database. A couple of Colorado websites, I was able to get city boundaries. Contour lines proved to be more challenging than I expected it to be. But I was able to obtain contour lines to be able to look at elevation and aspect and slope. I'll be able to build all of those from the contour lines. I know I have transportation networks on here twice. The Census Bureau has a slightly different data set. It's organized differently than the Forest Services. So I'll probably do some combination of these transportation networks. And NOAA for my average temperature data that I plan on looking at. Okay. So this is just a brief look at some of my data so far. So I have the plant locations that I got from the Forest Service. This is the state of Colorado, as you can see from the inset map. And I have 2 of the major interstate highways out here highlighted. So that's I-25 that runs north-south through the state, and I-70 runs east-west through the state. And then I have other interstate and US roads in the lighter red. I have a lot more road data than this, and most of these locations are actually off of much smaller roads. And then in the green, I have national forests, and just for some perspective, I have cities. So right there where I-25 and I-70 merge, kind of in the middle of the state, that's Denver, and then down a little bit is Colorado Springs, where I'm located. So just a quick look at my data so far. So my analytical methods, so I've started playing in RStudio. This is a screen capture of plotting those teasel locations within the state of Colorado. And I have a lot more script writing to do. So there's 2 different functions that I may end up using. So the plan is for me to use both of them and see which one seems to explain the locations better, which model seems to fit the data better. So there's a generalized linear model, the GLM function, and then there's a spatial logistic regression model. So that generalized linear model, we can use that with any logistic or any binary data. So some of the examples that you see sometimes are health data, so factors that can impact whether or not somebody comes down with a particular disease, things like that. So cancer a lot of times was an example I saw for generalized linear model for the uses of that, but I can still use it for my spatial data. And then the SLRM function would be specifically for spatial point data. So yeah, the intent is that I will use both of them and see which one explains my data better. The predictors I'll be using, I've broken them into continuous and categorical data. So elevation data, as I mentioned previously, I'll build my aspect and slope data from the elevation data. Proximity to water sources, teasel's pretty dependent on water, and especially out west where it's not as wet as it is back east. It can certainly be a determining factor for where the plant can be supported. Canopy cover, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the teasel loves the sunlight. So percentage of canopy coverage will be a important factor. Average temperature during the growing season, proximity to transportation networks, and distance to population centers. Both of these I mentioned because people help to move, help to spread this. Most of us are familiar with that with plants, that they can get picked up on cars, they can get picked up on shoes, in our backpacks, stuff like that. So transportation networks and human presence through population centers have been suggested to be significant, and our categorical factors there. We have soil characteristics, so type of soil that the common teasel prefers, and human presence. So I'm still trying to figure out how to describe human presence. It'll probably end up being some combination of activities in the area, because if we're looking at national forests, so are there campgrounds? Are there parking lots there? Are there hiking trails? Are there forest ranger stations? Things of that sort. And so this might end up being categorical, or it may end up being ranked. based on how much human presence is in a location. So we're trying to figure out how to depict that to be able to include it, because it has been suggested in many studies to be significant or impactful, important to predicting where common teasel is, but not many studies have tackled that characteristic to be able to include it in their analysis. So now we get to our results. So as I mentioned earlier, logistic regression lends itself to building probability maps. So this is just an example. This is not my data. I am certainly not that far along yet. So this is a sample of a probability map of European crossbill. So this is, it's a bird, and this is in Switzerland. And so this study looked at different species distribution preferences, and was able to produce this probability map to help depict where you might find this European crossbill species. So that's my one output, and this is one of the end results that the Forest Service would really like, because this is usable to them. So if they look at this and they see the white or the reddish areas showing a higher probability, then they know, okay, these are areas that maybe we should go and check and see if there's common teasel that we need to get rid of. Or if these are locations where a biological control needs to be implemented. So this is one of the end results that the Forest Service wants, and then also the modifiable Python program to allow them, so I'll produce some probability maps based on my site characteristics, but as time progresses and as they find more locations where the common teasel is, they'll want to continue to be able to produce these probability maps, but everybody might not be very RStudio savvy. So if I have a nice Python program that they can run through Arc, that is much more beneficial to them, much more usable to them. So presentation of results, I've mentioned the Forest Service a couple times. So for my job, I work for MGIS out here in Colorado Springs. So we have, and I work at Northcom, that's where I sit. So I see Forest Service people pretty much every day. And so we have a relationship with them. And this is a project that they were interested in. And so since they are basically who I am doing this project for, it makes the most sense for me to simply present it directly to them up in Lakewood, Colorado. So I actually won't be presenting at a conference, because then in order for them to receive my results directly from me, then they would need to send people to this conference. So it makes most sense for me just to drive up the road up to Lakewood, Colorado, and there's other federal agencies up there. USGS is down the street, another NGA office is down the street, and so we'll do like an open invitation. And so the Forest Service employees I've been working with and their colleagues and other individuals from across agencies will hopefully come and receive my results. And estimated completion date, end of July, or summer term. End of summer term. Let's see, so way ahead. So what the Forest Service wants to do with all of this is they want this to help assist them in being able to locate where common teasel is. I mentioned human presence and trails and campgrounds and stuff like that. Sometimes teasel is found simply by people spotting it. Because like I said, oftentimes it doesn't get sampled because it's uncomfortable to sample it. So this can kind of lead to biased discovery, as I mentioned here, because it gets located where people are. And if there's some remote location that the teasel happened to find itself, we might not come across that because there's nobody there to see it. So this model, this program would assist them in being able to find other locations that the teasel might exist, that they might want to check on, where there aren't necessarily people there to tell them like, hey, we spotted this teasel out here. Python program will be validated by field visits. They are actually, the Forest Service is actually going out and looking where people are telling them that they spot it. And so that is how the program will be validated. So they'll use it they'll have the probability maps that will suggest locations where the teasel might be, and then they will go out to those locations and see if they need to be removed or if a biocontrol needs to be implemented in that location. Project timeline. So obviously we're here at December 18, so I'm most of the way through 596A, which is the development of my project proposal. So I'm trying to move the chat window out of the way. Let's see, I've already been collecting the necessary data, as we could see from some of the results, or from plotting it into RStudio and from the quick map that I made in ARC. So I've already found a lot of my data. As I mentioned, I'm still working on how to do the human presence and getting the contour lines into a good format. So I'll continue collecting my data. And while I'm doing that, I'll start playing with the logistic regression analysis. So playing with the SLRM function and playing with the GLM function, getting my data into RStudio, because for anyone that writes code, it's not necessarily quick. And then once I make some progress with my logistic regression analysis, then I'll start working on the Python program kind of on the side in the background. And that should overlap with 596B that I'm planning to take next summer, present to the Forest Service by the end of the summer, make some updates based on the feedback that will very possibly extend past 596B. And actually the writing the program that's in that dark blue, that very well may extend past 596B as well. I probably should have made that bar longer. But that's kind of my expectation for my timeline. Some references. And that is my project proposal. I would love to take some questions, and I welcome everyone's feedback.
If you have questions, type them in the chat window, or actually if you find it easier to talk, just unmute and talk through your microphone. But also, Becky, if people do type it in the chat window, can you read it out, because the recording doesn't record what's in the chat window?
Certainly. So I received the question asking how far back do the records for teasel distribution go? So the Forest Service has been tracking teasel locations back to 2009. And we know that it was introduced to the US as early as the 1700s, but the data I'll be using will be going back to 2009, provided by the Forest Service. I received a question, have you looked into using elevation rasters instead of elevation contours? I've usually found this is available in most areas, at least at some resolution. Yes, I have. Yeah, if I can get the rasters, I will certainly use that instead. I was able to find rasters for the entire country, and then I would be able to save out a subset of it. Or I was able to find small rasters that I would be able to piece together, but there were literally 80 some of them for the state of Colorado. If I did not expect elevation to be so difficult for me to find. That was actually the first data that I went looking for because I thought it would be easy to find. So if you know of a good place where I can get state level elevation rasters, I am all ears, and I would certainly welcome it because I thought it was going to be easy to find. And I went to Colorado's Geological Society and all these different websites, and they all sent me back to data.gov, and there were literally 80 some huge files that I would need to download and merge them all together. So I'm all ears. I would love feedback on that. I received another question asking, can you quickly give an idea of how this species is typically removed from extensive areas? So I think it this point, so there weren't really any studies on removal. Most of the studies are on biological controls and introducing biological controls, because the teasel doesn't actually have any natural controls here because it's not from here. And the same question, second part, is, are there herbivores that consume this species? Not that I've seen and not that I have read. So I'm not sure is the short of the answer. So give an idea of how the species is typically removed. I haven't actually heard accounts of how they are removing it, because it's more about, I think it's more about controlling the spread of it. And then herbivores, I haven't seen that mentioned in any of my studies, but I will, that's a good point. That's a good question to ask. I appreciate that, thank you. Is teasel related to thistle or completely different? Also an excellent question. Appearance-wise, it certainly looks similar. I'm not sure if they are in the same family. I would need to look in. I'm familiar with thistle because we have it out here, but I'm not that familiar with it to know if they are actually related. And I don't know the origins of thistle either. So I don't know if it's a native species or if that one was introduced as well. They said I actually thought that I was just pronouncing thistle oddly at first because it's also an invasive, or it's also often invasive. But no, so it is different. I don't know if they are related. And someone else mentioned, if they are, I have seen countless deer and horses that love thistle. So if they are related, then that would suggest herbivores that would consume it. So we have tons of deer and elk out here, but they don't seem to be helping to control it. So I'm not sure.
I think that's it for questions. Thank you very much. Becky, do you want to stop sharing your screen? Great.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Okay, our next presenter is Michael Bowser. Whenever you're ready, I'll start the timer.
All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, yep,
Okay.
and we can hear you as well, so good.
All right, wonderful. All right, well, my name is Michael Bowser. Here to take some time to share with you guys my capstone project, an object-based image analysis of pipeline wellhead vegetation. My advisor for this project has been Charlotte O'Neill Dunn. And I'm going to start by going through some introduction and background details of my project. So the destruction of pipeline infrastructure like wellheads can be very dangerous and costly for pipeline operators. Poor vegetation management surrounding the wellheads is one of the main reasons issues occur. These issues could be easily avoided if the operator had a better understanding of the types of land cover surrounding their infrastructure. The project I'm working on will attempt to accurately classify the land cover around 422 wellheads, and these wellheads are located in Western New York. And the hope is to offer a better understanding of the issues that surround the wellheads, and hopefully allow the pipeline operators to easily address any problems that might come up before they become major issues. So the project will use the object-based feature extraction tools within eCognition to put together a detailed land cover rule set. The rule set will integrate current multispectral imagery and LiDAR data into the workflow, utilizing spectral and elevation signatures within these data sets. So to give you an idea of what the wellheads look like and just kind of what vegetation surrounds like an ideal wellhead, I have a couple photos taken from the actual well field that the study is based on. And all 4 of these photos are clear vegetation surrounding the wellhead. The area surrounding the wellhead that we're concerned with is a 60-foot kind of is the magic number. The vegetation surrounding the wellhead within 60 feet should all be like a low height herbaceous vegetation. It should be, shouldn't have any trees, no kind of scrubby, woody stemmed shrubs nearby, and obviously no structures or pavement or anything like that. It should be just a clear, low vegetated plot of land. So moving forward, the next 4 photos I have here show 4 wellheads that either have very, very bad issues going on with them, or wellheads that could have future issues. So the photo in the top left and bottom right, both you can't really see the wellhead because it has a fairly large tree that collapsed on it. The top right and bottom left wellheads they don't have any current issues, but as you can see, the plot around the wellhead is not a 60-foot cleared area around it, and could have future issues if they're not addressed. So the trees and scrub need to be cleared surrounding it, giving it a good solid vegetation surrounding it. So the issues of the collapsed trees and other encroaching vegetation don't affect the wellhead. So the location of the project, as I mentioned, is in Western New York, just southeast of Jamestown and just north of the Pennsylvania border, kind of near the Allegheny National Forest. And in the bottom right corner of the map, you can see the Allegheny Reservoir. And then within the study area, as I mentioned, 422 wellheads are going to be assessed. And the map on the image on the right shows the distribution of the wellheads that we'll be looking at. So each wellhead will have 2 buffers associated with them. As I mentioned in the first slide, 60 feet is kind of the magic number for the surrounding area of the wellhead. So this will allow the pipeline operator to get a snapshot of what type of vegetation is within the 60-foot buffer and what type of vegetation management plans they need to develop to either remove or trim back trees or remove trees and scrub. So the 60-foot buffer is, that's what they're concerned with, and they're trying to develop plans to remove any troublesome vegetation. So the 300-foot buffer is more for assessing the surrounding conditions and any access constraints that any people might have when accessing the wellhead. So in the image shown on the left, as you can see, there's a pretty dense forest to the west of the wellhead. So with the vegetation data that I'm hoping to collect, anyone coming out to service the wellhead would know that they can't access it from the west, and it would most likely have to be accessed through that driveway to the northeast of the wellhead. This is really important for these guys out there, because the wellhead or the pipeline operators really have very little understanding of really where these wellheads are and what's going on around them. They don't even really know what property they're on and stuff like that. So this type of analysis could be really useful for not only preserving the wellhead, but also helping them understand how and where they can access the wellheads the easiest. So next, I'm going to go through my, my project workflow here. So data acquisition. The past couple weeks, I've gotten to spent a lot of time acquiring the data, processing it, and getting it into a usable state for analysis within eCognition. The study uses two main primary data sets as the foundation of the rule set analysis. First, on the left, I have LiDAR data, and then on the right, I have an image of the 4-band MAPE imagery. Both were from 2017. The LiDAR data was collected between the spring of 2017 all the way through the summer, and then the NAPE imagery is summer 2017. So very lucky, was able to get some very recent imagery and elevation data. Some of the surrounding states and counties like Pennsylvania and Ohio had very limited current LiDAR data and elevation data. I think Pennsylvania and Ohio both were looking at 2006, 2007 elevation data. So luckily New York has a pretty good current LiDAR program. The 4-band imagery, like I said, is sourced from the National Agricultural Imagery Program. It contains 4 bands. The near infrared band, or band 4, is going to be very useful for the analysis. Band 4 tends to respond fairly strongly to healthy vegetation. So it's going to be very useful for my analysis moving forward. So as I said, I've been able to spend a good amount of time acquiring the data as well as processing the data. There are a lot of pre-processing techniques that can be used to increase the accuracy of the data, as well as make it easier to manage or cut down the processing time. Most of the techniques used to prepare the imagery and elevation data for processing can be grouped into 3 different categories. So first, spectral pre-processing. Second is spatial, and then finally LiDAR pre-processing. The next couple slides, I'll go through each of these and break down what I've done and how I'm going to use it moving forward. So spectral pre-processing. The spectral pre-processing for this project, it involves the creation of indices or band ratios that are going to help enhance the imagery. This analysis will use 2 different band ratios. The first on the left is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And then the second is the NDWI, which is the Normalized Difference Water Index. Both of these are pretty named pretty well and describe what they're going to be doing. So the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index will help identify healthy vegetation, and the Normalized Difference Water Index will help identify any saturation, or help identify bodies of water and streams and rivers. So both of the images, you can see the NDWI, the dark blues show heavily saturated areas. So both of these will be used within my rule set within eCognition. So next, spatial pre-processing that I've done for the data so far. The spatial pre-processing for this analysis, it's not as glamorous as the spectral or LiDAR processing, but it's going to make the data a lot easier to work with, and decrease the amount of processing time that the rule set will take. Ensuring that all the data is in the same coordinate system obviously is a very important first step. All the data, raster, vector data has been projected into the New York State Plane Coordinate System. And since everything's going to be packaged up as a final geodatabase, it's very important from the get-go to have everything in the same projection and coordinate system. The NAPE imagery was downloaded in multiple tiles. So mosaicing the imagery together into a single raster data set is very important, and it cuts down on the processing time as well. And then once the mosaic is created, clipping the imagery to the study area to make sure no extra imagery would be included that's outside of the study area will reduce the amount of time it takes to run the analysis. Finally, the LiDAR preprocessing. LiDAR can be really valuable if it's in the right format and has been processed and can be very valuable to the rule set. The best way to use LiDAR data is to interpolate it into a raster so that the entire study area is accounted for as a continuous surface. For this project, the LiDAR processing is broken into 3 parts. First is the creation of a digital elevation model, or a DEM. The DEM is going to depict the ground elevation and exclude everything that sits above the ground, like trees and shrub and structures. So after the DEM is created, I went through and processed the LiDAR data to create a DSM. And the images here, so I have the aerial on the left, so the circle is showing the same spot within all of the aerial, DEM, and DSM. So the digital elevation model, at the centroid of that circle, the elevation is 395 meters, while the center of the circle on the DSM is 403. So to create that final third step, I went through and subtracted the elevation model from the surface model to create a normalized DSM. And that same point at the centroid of that circle sits at 8 meters. So this is really valuable within eCognition because it allow you to pull out heights of buildings, trees, and any kind of mid-level vegetation. So that center of that circle is a building that sits at 8 meters height. So the forest and trees around it will all be able to be classified based on their height within my rule set. So once all the data has been processed, it's time to load it into eCognition and begin creating my segmentation and developing my rule set. So the input data sets, as I showed, were the 4-band imagery as well as the normalized DSM. Object-based image analysis is basically a method of segmenting and classifying features in an aerial image through an automated process. Object-based image analysis allows the user to set up a sophisticated rule set by putting together algorithms that segment the image and then classify the objects based on their shape, size, spatial, and also spectral properties. Many forms of remote sensing rely fully on pixels, and they don't do this kind of grouping and segmentation, which there's a lot of value in segmenting and creating objects instead of pixels, because these objects have a lot of values behind them that allow you to classify things more accurately, as well as they also have awareness of basically their surroundings. So an object is aware of the object next to it, which also adds some great value to your analysis. So once the segmentation is complete, the classification process can start, and you can go through your land cover classes and using the objects that were segmented and the values behind them, you can start to pick apart your features and apply values to them. So the next couple slides, I'll go through both the segmentation process as well as the classification in a little bit more detail. So, like I said, traditional remote sensing is pixel based, and all pixels are the same size, same shape, and they're not aware of the pixel next to it, which you can do some good analysis with that, but there's so much more value to having an object-based analysis that creates the segmentation and allows you to create aware objects with values behind them. So for my analysis, two segmentations are going to be used in my rule set. The first is a multi-resolution segmentation. This takes in values of scale, shape, compactness, and lets you apply image weights based on the NDSM or the different bands in the NAPE imagery. The second segmentation is a spectral difference segmentation, and this one is useful for long linear objects like streams or roads, and it lets you kind of group and merge neighboring objects into the central object. So yeah, like I said, very useful for long linear objects. And using two segmentations is also very useful, is just because one segmentation worked for the tree canopy doesn't necessarily mean that's the best segmentation for roads, because they have, all my features have very different sizes and shapes and compactness and stuff like that. So it's definitely good to have multiple segmentations throughout your rule set. So now that the image has been segmented and has useful statistics associated with each object, it's time to develop the actual classification rule set. Objects can be classified based on any of the following variables: geometry, area, color, shape, texture, and adjacency. There's just a lot of options to get the best classification possible. So these next couple slides, I'm going to go through the different objects that I'm going to be classifying. So the first object that I'm going to be classifying is tree canopy. And then I have my rule set over there on the right-hand side, and the tree canopy is highlighted. So what we know about tree canopy is trees tend to be tall objects, and with the NDVI values, we know that healthy vegetation has high NDVI values. So within the rule set, I have the mean NDSM value of greater than 3 and an NDVI value that pulls out the healthy vegetation. And also, to clean it up a bit, we can look at the texture of the trees compared to that of roads and water bodies and stuff like that. So there are additional classifications that we can add to clean up the tree canopy. So moving on to the next class, structures. So structures, like tree canopy, they tend to be high, tall objects. But unlike the vegetation and tree canopy, they have very low NDVI values. So pairing the NDSM and pulling out the tall objects with a low NDVI value is a good way to extract the structures within the imagery. So water was a little tricky and had to be done a little differently than the other classes. So streams and water bodies are very different shapes and sizes. Streams tend to be long linear objects, when water bodies tend to be, at least in this study area, smaller ponds, which are kind of round and circular shaped, so that I had some issues pulling out the water as one class, so I ended up breaking it into two different classes where the streams and water bodies were separate from each other and then merged at the end to create a single water class. So what we do know about water is they have low near infrared value, low density value, and this is where I use the NDWI index to pull out high NDWI values to extract the water. Next, pavement. Pavement tends to have low density values, and like buildings, they have low NDVI values, and they tend to be smoother objects rather than the tree canopy that can be a little coarser and rougher looking, and also different from the structures. They have a very, very low NDSM value. And finally, the last class is shrubland. And the shrubland is the medium height objects with high NDVI values. So they range from 3 meters to 1 meter. And then just like trees, they have a high NDVI value. And then that was able to extract the shrubland. So that was my classification, and then once the final classification is complete, I'll start to compile my final products. The first being a final geodatabase that has all of the land cover feature classes within it, as well as some of the vector-based data, along with the aerial imagery clipped to the study area. A final report will be produced, as well as an accuracy assessment. So the accuracy assessment will include user and producer accuracy, and trying to achieve a goal of 90% overall accuracy for the data set. The company I worked for, we've done a lot of projects like this, and it's been a manual, like, photo interpretation approach of just digitizing the land cover. And we've been able to achieve a pretty high field verified accuracy of between 90 and 95%. So I think for this project to be successful, I'm shooting for 90% overall accuracy. My project timeline, after the proposal presentation tonight, continuing to work on it on my own between now and April. And I have an abstract submitted for the MGIS conference on the 25th and 26th of April, and that's located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that's all I have. Anyone have any questions? I think I lost my chat window here, so I'm having trouble.
If you go back, can you see if you put your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, does it not come up? No? Ah.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay, so field visits will be used to assess the accuracy. No, I was hoping to do that and have this project. My company has been working on a project in the same area, and we were hoping to have field crews visit it, but just the timeline isn't going to match up. The project got pushed, and just things didn't work out exactly how I wanted them. But I'm going to do just a more manual accuracy assessment. So another question, how do you decide what rules to use for classifying each of the different objects? It was a lot of inspection. So once the objects were segmented, it was a lot of going through and looking at the different variables associated with each objects, like the different spectral signatures, NDSM values. So I mean, the tree canopy was fairly simple with looking at, you want to pull out the tall objects and then also use the NDVI values to pull that out. So it was just a lot of like manual selecting of the segmented objects and just seeing what the variables were for each object. Have you considered including FEMA flood extents to show which wellheads are likely to flood? No, I haven't, but that's a really good idea. The images that I showed in the first couple of slides were taken at a previous well field that we did a job on, and there were a lot of issues with the wellheads flooding, and a lot of them were at kind of lower elevations, and the grading was not great for moving water away from the wellhead. So no, didn't cross my mind to look at the FEMA data, but that's something to consider. I appreciate it.
I think that's it for questions. Thank you, Tim. Good luck with the rest of your project. Okay, our next presenter is Matt. If you can start loading your presentation.
Will do. Thanks, Justine. Thanks, Tim, for the kind of segue there into the FEMA portion, which is what I'll be talking about in my presentation. Can you guys see that?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, now it's coming
Got
through.
it. Great.
Yep. So whenever you're ready, I'll put the timer on.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready. So my project is the rise of the superstorm. How accurately is FEMA assessing flood risk in today's climate? Just a little background. Name is Matt Carroll. I've been working for the last 14 years on a federal contract that my previous employer had with FEMA, actually making amendments and revisions to FEMA's floodplain maps, which are known as flood insurance rate maps. So I'm very intimately familiar with how those maps are created, how they're amended, how they're changed, how they're updated or not updated, and the kind of the data that goes behind that. So this topic really struck a chord with me because I've seen with recent storms that have occurred, you know, how often the maps aren't really reflecting the true flood risk that's currently present with a lot of these areas around the country, with the increasing number of superstorms and hurricanes and general flooding events that used to be, you know, kind of out of the norm and now just seem to be more and more kind of the normal routine as each flooding year comes through. So I'll be working with James O'Brien. He's my professor that I'm working with on this project. And he's a really good fit for a couple of reasons. He actually works for an insurance company in Australia assessing flood risk and modeling out flood risk for his company. So he has a strong background in floodplain management and flood risk itself, which is fantastic. And then also he has a strong background in programming, especially Python and web mapping applications. And that's something that I want to learn more about and what I want to have my project convey. I want to take that flood risk and that flood insurance data that FEMA maps out and kind of use Python and web mapping applications to show the results and to show how accurately FEMA's flood maps actually are or are not. So, so my intent of the project is to compare the geospatial data from 3 recent events is what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at Hurricane Harvey, Superstorm Sandy, and Hurricane Irma, and then compare those areas that were affected to the flood zone data that FEMA has, and kind of assess how accurately those areas are being mapped appropriately. So, and then, as I said, create a web mapping application that easily displays the differences between FEMA's assessed flood risk from their flood insurance rate map, and then the flood damage that was actually caused by those particular storms. And then the Python that I'd like to use, I'd like to write a script to kind of make this like a living, breathing kind of project, something that will be more than just what I present when I do present it, but also something that someone could use in the future to kind of use the same application, the same mapping application, but tailor it to their individual needs, or maybe tailor it to future storms that are to occur in the future, so they can kind of easily plug in, flood data from a future storm into my application to get a quick look as to, okay, how accurately did FEMA's flood map really convey the risk for these particular areas that were hit. So my overall discussion topics and research focus, and what I'm going to kind of talk about with my presentation here, is how FEMA determines the insurance rating and how they do map the floodplains. The recent history that's showing how these modern storms are bigger and stronger and causing a lot more damage than they have been in the past, which is kind of how this question came up for me and how I want to tackle this project, because a lot of FEMA's flood information, they're looking at regression analysis that looks at a set time period of historic data. And I think what we're starting to see is that the storms of the last 10, 15 years are really above and beyond what you would normally see through an average 100-year period in the past. So the last point there, how well do these maps actually match those storm events? So FEMA determines their floodplain based on, they call it a special flood hazard area, and that's SFHA for short. And that's areas that defined by the area that will be inundated by a flood event that has a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. So it's a probability. It's not, a lot of people think it's, a 100-year flood means you get flooded once. That means you're not going to be flooded again for another 100 years. And that's not the case. It's a probability where you could get flooded, 200-year floods within a 7-year period, or you could go 200 years and not get flooded once with a flood at that level. So how that level is determined, this is from the USGS. And the 100-year flood is used by a lot of agencies, even though FEMA is the one responsible for the floodplain maps through their National Flood Insurance Program. The 1% flood is a probability flood that a lot of agencies use and a lot of local jurisdictions as well. With the USGS, I like their definition. So it's a statistical technique through a process called frequency analysis, where they estimate the probability of the occurrence of a given precipitation event. And then they look at that precipitation event and they judge it based on a recurrence interval and to create that probability. So as you can see here, this example, excuse me. There's a 1 in 50 chance that, I got the chat window kind of, there we go. that 6.6 inches of rain will fall in a certain area in a 24-hour period during any given year. So any rainfall total of that level of 6.6 inches in a 24-hour period would be considered the 50-year recurrence interval. So that'd be considered the 50-year flood. And as I was mentioning, it's a probability. So this chart kind of breaks down what those flood events really mean. And like my professor, James, he mentions he likes to compare it to kind of like a horse race. That kind of puts in people's minds what that kind of means as well. If you had like, you know, these 6 flooding events as horses in a corral that were about to run a race, you know, you'd have the favorite that's got a 2-to-1 shot. You'd have the next favorite's got a 5-to-1 shot and so forth. So that 100-year flood's like the dark horse. That's the long shot horse, right? So if you run that race every time, eventually that dark horse is going to win. And sometimes they won't win, but sometimes they'll win, you know, twice in five races, you know. So that's kind of the way he likes to kind of phrase it, to give people an idea as to what the 100-year flood really means in terms of probabilities. And as I was alluding to at the beginning, what I think we're seeing that this 100-year flood is not necessarily a 100-year flood anymore in the way people think of it, or the way the definition, the word itself would seem to suggest. The reinsurance firm Aon Benfield released data to the USA Today a couple years ago that said there's been actually 6 1,000-year storms just in the state of South Carolina since 2010. And that was in 2015 that they issued that. I don't think there's been a 1,000-year storm to hit them since then. It's possible Florence might have done that in certain areas, but North Carolina, I think, took the brunt of that storm. But regardless, 6 1,000-year storms have occurred in South Carolina since 2010. So it kind of shows you how these former, you know, definitions of the 100-year flood that federal and state agencies and local jurisdictions are using throughout the country may not be the best assessment of flood risk in today's reality. So these are a list of the top 5 costliest hurricanes that have occurred. This is from NOAA. And as you can see there, all 5 of the costliest storm events have occurred since Katrina in 2005. So within the last 13 years, all 5 of the most costliest storms occurred. And you can see Harvey, Maria, and Irma were all just last year. So 3 of the top 5 costliest storms of all time just happened last year alone. And so, as I said at the beginning, I'm focusing on Harvey, Sandy, and Irma. And the reasons for that are because of the fact that all 3 of those storms are in the top 5 that NOAA has indicated here. They've all occurred within the last 6 years, with 2 of them occurring in the last year alone. So these are very recent storms. And I expect to see a good amount of data that I'll be able to use because of that, since the geospatial data for hurricanes and for storm events has really progressed within the last 10, 20 years compared to the data that was being used before that for these flood risk assessments. And the other reason I like these 3 storms is because they're in 3 distinctly different geographic locations. So you had Harvey in Texas, you had Sandy that battered the Northeast in the New York City, New Jersey area, and then Irma that hit Florida last year. So why is this important? It's important because FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, that's used as the federal standard for all lending institutions, realtors, and insurance agents in determining the flood risk of a property. So whenever a home loan is taken out for a mortgage, whenever flood insurance is assessed through an insurance agent for a property owner, they're always using the flood insurance rate map that FEMA produces to determine how much flood risk is this property at and how much coverage does it need in order to properly cover the loss to their property and to their belongings. So it's extremely important, because if we're not assessing that flood risk appropriately, which I believe we're not, and I think a lot of people are starting to question it, it's usually the taxpayer that bears the brunt of that bill, and it's really adding up. Every storm that hits like this, it's bankrupting the National Flood Insurance Program. They're needing taxpayer money to bail it out. And a big part of that is because they're assessing the insurance risk based on these flood maps that aren't really showing the full risk that a lot of these properties are in. So that's why I really like this topic and believe it's an important one. And so I'll get to the data portion of what I plan to use and what I've found so far. FEMA is, again, the ones that hold the National Flood Insurance Program data. They're the ones that officially assess the risk. So there are a lot of areas that'll assess flood risk above and beyond what FEMA has. North Carolina actually is a great example. They're probably the most progressive state when it comes to that as far as their flood risk data is concerned and the web mapping applications they have. So some will go above and beyond it, but for the most part, FEMA's base data is what's looked at and what is used for flood risk. And it's also the only official flood risk data. So anytime there's a dispute or a question as to what flood zone a particular property is in, this is the data that is the end all be all. So their Map Service Center and their Mapping Information Platform are two websites that really have a lot of flood risk study data. The Mapping Information Platform has a KMZ file of the National Flood Hazard Layer, so I'm hoping that I could download that information and kind of use that as like a base for the digital data for their floodplain zones, and then be able to kind of compare that digital data that they provide with the particular areas that I'm interested in. And not every area has that digital flood data, but the ones in question do. Harris County, Texas, and the Houston area, Florida, most of their counties, if not all, have this digital flood data, and then New York as well. So the data that is available, I'll be able to use for my project. So for Hurricane Harvey, I'm going to use data from the USGS. They published a very detailed study that wasn't just map data and geospatial data, but all sorts of water data that showed the effects of the hurricane and what flooded and how high. And so they used peak stage data and a lot of their gauging stations. They created 19 inundation maps to document the extent of the maximum depth of the flooding, and created digital data sets of that area along with models and raster files. So I expect to be using a lot of the information from the USGS for this particular storm event to determine which areas were inundated and which weren't. And I already know from my research that a lot of Harris County, Texas, a lot of rivers weren't even mapped, if you can believe it or not. So it'll be interesting to see if there are areas that were completely swamped by this storm that weren't even shown as a flood zone at the time of the storm events. So that's just baffles my mind. But that'll be interesting to see. With Hurricane Irma, the Department of Homeland Security seemed to have the best information that I could find. They had a lot of geospatial data for that particular hurricane. So that's the source that I plan to use for that particular hurricane. And then for Superstorm Sandy, New York City had a lot of good geospatial data to use for that particular flooding event. I'm gonna do some more research to see if New Jersey has some information for this as well, because the Jersey Shore really got battered with Superstorm Sandy, and a lot of the reconstruction efforts is being done or has been done in that particular location, because a lot of those properties were just houses on stilts in some situations. So I'm definitely gonna look at that. But the reason why I'm looking at 3 different sources with the USGS and with the Department of Homeland Security and then New York City's Open Data Project is, again, it's because a lot of times, even though FEMA has the end-all be-all flood insurance rate maps that are used for flood assessment and risk, it's actually something that a lot of the data that is used to create those flood insurance rate maps come from state agencies, they come from other federal agencies, they come from local county agencies. So it's not, a lot of people think with FEMA's maps, it's FEMA actually going out and mapping all these areas themselves, when that's not the case at all. They are mapping some areas themselves, but a lot of times they're dependent on other agencies, and especially local agencies, to get them the data that they need to create these maps. So a lot of times the flood data as well for these storm events and things of that nature are also collected on a local level and handled in-house. So a lot of times you see like local agencies that actually have better data or more data than FEMA might have. So yeah, as I said, what I'll be doing is using these data sets and creating a web mapping application to hopefully easily display the differences and the similarities between FEMA's assessed flood risk and the actual flood damage that's been caused. And then I'd like to incorporate a Python script that's gonna allow interested stakeholders to kind of use any particular storm. Maybe they have Katrina data and they're interested in Katrina and they wanna just plug that data in really quick and kind of look at a side-by-side comparison of how that mapped out. And again, for future storms, I want to make it a living, breathing product, because I'm really even more interested though in having something that people can use going forward, not just look at these particular events, but also be able to kind of input data that for future storms that they can easily plug in to kind of see, where is FEMA getting the flood risk correctly on their flood insurance rate maps, and where are they falling behind? So that's the end of my presentation. This is something I'm going to be working on through next year. My target right now is a fall presentation, fall 2019. I'll be working, my next classes are going to be the advanced Python class. I've already taken the first Python class, so I'll be taking the next one on that, and then the web mapping applications class as well. So this is something I plan to continue working on, until I finish, more or less. So I'm probably going to be learning a lot of the things that I need to know with James during those courses. And so I'll be working on the capstone kind of in conjunction with the classwork that I'll already be doing for those remaining classes. And then target a presentation again in fall 2019 at this point. So that was all I had. So if anyone has any questions or comments or constructive criticism or anything, I'm more than welcome it. Okay, Bill Schwartz says he'd like to suggest sentence case. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Oh, okay, the all caps. Yeah, I'll definitely take that under advisement. I thought the caps looked better, but maybe it doesn't. Anyone else have any other opinion on that? Maybe it does suggest like a little too much in your face. I tend to write with all caps, so that's probably, I just think it pops better, but. Okay, Paul agrees that the sentence case would be easier to read. Fantastic, yeah, I'll definitely make the updates to that then. Tim suggests looking at NJGIN for MGIS data. Didn't find anything for Sandy, but might find something useful. Thanks for that. I'll definitely check them out. So again, that's any type of organizations like that I'm not aware of. I definitely welcome that, because a lot of flood data is even though FEMA collects it all, it is kind of haphazard. Some state agencies are really good with it and presenting the data, and others are a little more hands-off, and some local jurisdictions are really hands-on, and some are just bare bones. So it's kind of interesting, like a hunt, to find where the data's at for a particular location.
Any more questions? I have one question. So I missed the second to last slide. You mentioned something about you're using data from different storms. Is the flooding extent for all of the storms that you're going to be using properly documented?
It should be. Do you mean properly documented as to like what recurrence interval flood it was, or just where they're gathering the data from?
Well, probably both, and
Both.
what extent it reached to and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah. A lot of the data does kind of compare it to the recurrence intervals that are published by FEMA. So like the reinsurance firm Aon Benfield that indicated that 6,000-year storms hit South Carolina. They're basically taking the data they have and comparing it to whatever the 1,000-year flood recurrence interval is at that particular time to call it a quote-unquote 1,000-year flood. So a lot of the information I've seen does indicate that. I know Hurricane Harvey definitely satisfied that requirement. So Harris County as well, they're actually talking about possibly mapping to a 500-year flood in some areas in response to the fact that they didn't really assess the risk as well as they maybe could have ahead of time before this storm. So they're looking to beef up their kind of construction guidelines. But I think that's a great question. The second part of that, knowing the quality of the data, that's something I'll certainly have to dig into. Where are they getting the information from? Is it, I know with the USGS, with their information for Hurricane Harvey, they looked at aerial extent and kind of mapped it out that way. And I know with a lot of the data that I've seen with recent storm events, that's kind of the way they're doing it, is flying aerial, seeing where the flooding shows up on the aerial and just kind of mapping it out that way to see which areas were inundated or not. But that's a great point to keep in mind. I'll certainly, as I go forward with the project, be sure to focus on that and see exactly where that data is coming from and how they're arriving at those conclusions. Thanks for that.
Great. Thanks. Sometimes it's the most obvious things that sometimes get missed, unfortunately. So that's why I was just curious.
Yeah, no, I know, absolutely. And it is something I didn't, I just kind of assumed. So I'm really glad you did bring that up. I just know from my personal experience that that's how they usually, they get that data and determine which areas are inundated or not. But I can't for sure say that that's actually what they've done with this data, with the exception of the USGS report. I do know that's how they did it for that one, but I will have to check the others. So thanks for that.
Okay. Okay. Thanks everybody for waiting. We have one last presentation. Paul, if you can start loading your presentation.
You bet.
And then whenever you're ready, I'll put the timer on. But I think we're okay for time, so.
Great. All right. Share screen. Let's see if this works.
Okay, it's coming through.
All right. Now we'll see if I can.
Perfect. I can see your slides.
All right. Let's see if we can get it the way I want it. Yes. All right. So does everyone see a nice clean screen with just the slides?
Yep.
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love it when it actually works. Hi, I'm Paul Milhauser, and by way of background, I work exclusively in conservation, most of it in the Rocky Mountain West, but with occasional excursions to more remote places like Africa and Mongolia, although those are typically virtual excursions. And today I'll be talking about my capstone project, which is evaluating landscape connectivity and habitat fragmentation effects on elk in the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, so any suggestions for a nice abbreviated title will be welcome. So recent studies conducted by the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife have identified an alarming decline in elk populations in the Eagle and Roaring Fork Valleys of Colorado. Depending on the methodology used, it's estimated to be a decline from maybe 30 to more than 50% between 2002 and 2016. And even more alarming, the rate of elk calf production per cow has decreased to a level that suggests populations will not recover and will likely continue to decline. While the causes of the decline are not fully understood, current consensus is that multiple factors are likely at work and that human-caused habitat fragmentation and loss of connectivity, often relating to residential development and recreational trails, may be major contributors. Conversations with Colorado Parks and Wildlife staff suggest that a better understanding of the current degree of fragmentation and connectivity loss would be useful as they consider improving current management and assessing future proposals for trail building and other increases in human presence. So just a quick overview of my presentation. After a little further introduction, I'll move on to the research question, talk about the effects of fragmentation and loss of connectivity on wildlife, introduce the study area, give a little more thorough explanation of what fragmentation and connectivity are about, discuss my research methods and data sources, and then present my anticipated results. So why are elk of such great concern? They are not, after all, an endangered species, but in addition to being an iconic animal appreciated for its beauty, elk are an important economic resource for the area. Hunting is a major driver of the local economy, but due to this decline in population, the number of hunting tags issued annually in the area has decreased from 2,000 to 200. In Eagle and Pitkin counties, which include the majority of the study area, hunting's direct economic contribution exceeds $20 million annually. And participants in all kinds of other outdoor recreation are drawn to the area by its scenic beauty and by its abundant wildlife. And according to a 2013 study conducted for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, this region of Colorado, a bit larger than my study area, received an annual economic benefit of more than $7 billion from outdoor recreation activities. And that would include things like skiing and hiking, mountain biking, as well as hunting. So elk are the subject of a great deal of public concern and scientific research for these reasons, but they also represent a bellwether for the overall health of the wildlife of the area. Understanding the forces driving their decline is the first step towards ensuring healthy populations of elk and other wildlife in the future. So my research question is, are elk declines in population in the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys of Colorado correlated with changes to connectivity and habitat fragmentation over recent decades, after accounting for other possibly contributing variables such as hunting pressure and vegetative health? So over the last 20 years or so, research on human change to the landscape has increasingly emphasized the impacts of habitat fragmentation and loss of connectivity to the continued viability of wildlife populations. Development, whether it's in the form of roads, trails, or other infrastructure, can have a negative effect on both the quality of the habitat and on wildlife more generally. Some of the direct impacts include loss of access to crucial habitat, pollution, including noise and light pollution, as well as air, changes in wildlife behavior and activity, including reduced feeding and mating, increased potential for human-wildlife conflicts like crop disruption, and direct wildlife mortality from vehicle collisions. So in the long term, all of these effects together can lead to an increase in invasive species that are more comfortable with a human-influenced environment. That in turn reduces biodiversity by pushing out native species. And the remaining native species face decreased population viability and even lower biodiversity over time as they become extirpated. So my research approach is a temporal one. I'm going to follow the landscape change and elk population change from about 2000 to the present. In order to do so, I'm going to need to obtain elk population data, data regarding human-caused landscape changes, and I'll also need to look at other factors that might be driving the elk population decline. So here's a map of Colorado, and you see there sort of the west central mountainous region. And if we zoom in, we can see that this area is sort of dominated by the Roaring Fork and Eagle River valleys, which are both tributaries of the Colorado River. They both flow through public and private lands around White River National Forest, and the watersheds include the resort towns of Vail and Aspen, but also some pretty remote wilderness areas. The valleys and the surrounding watersheds provide habitat for a wide variety of wildlife and are home to pretty substantial elk herds, even after the declines. So my study area is going to consist of two data analysis units, which are used by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They designate them E15 and E16, and each of those corresponds to roughly the entire range of a single elk herd. Colorado Parks and Wildlife maintains records of historic herd population and herd composition by these data analysis units, so I'll be able to compare population changes over time to other changes in the landscape. And also, the red area shows the study area, and the orange area indicates a 25-kilometer buffer zone that I'm going to use to avoid edge effects, and that adds up to a total area of about 1.6 million hectares. As you can see, the study area includes a great deal of federally owned land, and that's good news because that means that the Forest Service, along with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, manages most of the critical habitat for elk and can adjust their management plans if my study suggests that would be helpful. So before diving in any further, I want to give you a quick explanation of habitat fragmentation and landscape connectivity. They're similar concepts, but there are also important distinctions between them. But before talking about either of them, I really need to explain what we mean by habitat. I think we all have a pretty good notion of it, but just to go a little more in depth, in the simplest terms, it's simply the part of the environment in which a species lives, feeds, and reproduces. But we also need to consider that a single species may require multiple habitat types in order to meet all of their needs. And even in their preferred habitat type, species may find that all habitat is not created equal. Some areas may be more effective in meeting the needs of the species, and sometimes just the size of the piece of habitat can be important. In particular, large areas of undisturbed habitat are critical for most species, and certainly for elk. All the needs of these species can't be met by a single patch of habitat. A lot of species prefer core habitat away from the edges of habitat patches. Also, these large unfragmented patches provide a bit of a safety net in the case of a disaster or climate change, because animals can temporarily or permanently move to undamaged areas within the region, and plants can recolonize from those undamaged areas. And as habitat patches become more and more fragmented, the connection between these patches becomes ever more important. All right, so what is habitat fragmentation? Again, simply speaking, it's the division of habitat into smaller patches. We'll go into a little bit more depth, but first let's talk about what is landscape connectivity. Well, it's the degree to which wildlife are able to move freely across the landscape, sometimes between those habitat patches. And while fragmentation is about the size and separation of these patches of habitat, connectivity is about the movement through and among the patches. So connectivity considers only the landscapes resistant to movement by wildlife, not quite the same thing as whether that piece of landscape is preferred habitat. So for example, a forest animal may still be able to cross stretches of grassland to reach another patch of forest. So here's the study area again. The different colors and the shades of colors represent different land cover. Alpine forests, grasslands, and mountain meadows, to name a few. In fact, there's about 24 different land cover types just within the study area. So habitat type is largely a product of that land cover. So the transition between different habitat types, such as between forest and meadow, creates a natural fragmentation of the landscape even before human influence comes into play. But a number of other factors exacerbate both that fragmentation and the loss of connectivity. There are a lot of natural barriers that cause fragmentation and loss of connectivity, including things like rivers and steep slopes. Development and the resulting destruction of natural habitats are, of course, a major cause of fragmentation and connectivity loss. But even lower levels of development and agricultural activities still have an effect on fragmentation and movement. And finally, some areas with little or no development still have roads or trails that can cause fragmentation and impede connectivity. So here's a quick example of habitat fragmentation in my study area that I hope will make the concept of fragmentation a little bit clearer. So here's a map that shows seasonal habitat used by elk in part of the study area. Production areas, which you see in the lower left there, are simply areas that cows use when they're giving birth and raising calves. And obviously the elk will move seasonally among these different areas. But even in this rugged area that has a lot of federally owned land, there are quite a few roads and trails. And each of those renders a disturbed area around it unsuitable for habitat. There's a lot of disagreement in the literature about exactly how wide an area, but from as little as 100 meters to as much as a kilometer, there can be some degree of effect. And after taking that into account, you can see that the landscape really turns into a bit of a jigsaw puzzle of fragments, many of which are quite small. And for connectivity, again, an example from some past research of mine might make it a little bit easier to understand and also hopefully to differentiate it from fragmentation. All the approaches to studying connectivity start with the concept of a resistant surface. And essentially, the landscape is divided into pixels, and a raster is created that assigns a resistance value to each pixel. The higher the value, the more difficult it is for wildlife to cross that pixel. For another project, I looked at connectivity across the state of Colorado and created a resistance surface that was based primarily on topography and the degree of human development. So this map shows a portion of northwestern Colorado. And as you can see, there's darker colors indicating more resistance occur around towns, but there are also areas of intensive agriculture or energy development that have substantial resistance. A lot of times, a least cost path technique is used when you're connecting specific locations, moving across that resistance surface. So sort of adding the resistance cost to the actual Euclidean distance between the points. But since I'm looking at a more generalized view of overall connectivity across the landscape, I used a piece of software called CircuitScape that simulates running electric current through the resistance surface. And it produces a map that just shows the volume of potential current flow or potential wildlife movement across the landscape. Higher current flow, shown in yellow, indicates that the wildlife are going to move disproportionately through that area because surrounding areas are constricting their movement. And there's a nice example of that sort of to the center left. And if we look back to the resistance surface, it's pretty clear that it's Highway 40 to the north and the White River and highway along it to the south that are the primary obstacles to connectivity. So wildlife is force through what is usually referred to as a pinch point there, and blocking it would cause a major loss of connectivity. So that's the kind of information that some of these agencies might use in their planning process. So in order to understand the roles of fragmentation and connectivity loss, I'll need to gather data and apply a series of modifications and analyses to that data. Here's a flow chart that shows my workflow, and there will not be a quiz on this at the end of the presentation. Please do not attempt to read all of it. I'll just give you a quick overview. So first, I'm going to assemble data sources, mostly from publicly available data. Then I'll apply some ArcGIS operations to get those data sets in a format that's more useful. Then I'll take those data sets and compile them and put them into a resistant surface and a fragmentation landscape. And you can see those two have a lot of elements in common. Next, I'll use a variety of analytical tools to come up with some measures of fragmentation and connectivity loss. And finally, I'll use spatial statistics to analyze the correlation between the analysis results, elk populations, and other possible explanatory variables. That's going to be the most challenging part of the process, as a number of analyses do not yield straightforward results that are easy to quantify for statistical analysis. And the ultimate hope is that I'll be able to draw conclusions from these results that will provide insight into the causes of elk population decline and allow me to make recommendations to the management agencies. So I'll be using 3 analytical tools. For addressing fragmentation, I'll first of all use FragStats, which is sort of the most commonly used fragmentation analysis software, which can produce 40+ different statistical measures of fragmentation. And part of my work will be selecting the ones that are most meaningful here. I'll also be using a connected patches tool that I'll talk about a little more later. And to address connectivity, I'll be using CircuitScape, as I mentioned before. So FragStats is a raster-based tool, and it considers every transition between habitat types as fragmentation, regardless of whether there's any human influence. In fact, it doesn't address fragmentation by roads and trails directly unless the user designates them as a separate habitat type, which I do plan to do. The connected patches tool is a vector tool that I've modified based on some original software developed by Rebecca Loram. And it focuses on the roads. So as long as wildlife can move between patches of habitat, whatever type, without encountering a road or other development, patches of the same habitat type within that zone are considered contiguous. And that approach may provide a more realistic measure of how large and mobile wildlife like elk uses the landscape. And just to give you a sense of how the different tools might look at the landscape, here's a landscape of Boulder County where I just completed a fragmentation study. And the developed areas, roads, and trails are all shown in white. They fragment the obviously already fragmented landscape with the different habitat types. There's something like 50 different habitat types within Boulder County. FragStats also provides those statistics I talked about, so I can look at things like the average patch size of each type of habitat, the ratio of perimeter to area, and the distance between patches of the same habitat type to get a better sense of what the degree of fragmentation is really like. If I looked at the same map as the connected patches tool would view it, it looks quite a bit different. It focuses on where the wildlife can go without encountering human developments, and it's got less concern about the transitions between different habitat zones. So this results in a number of contiguous zones that may contain multiple habitat types. For example, you can see the upper left there, there's a large contiguous area, and if we go back to the FragStats view, it's actually composed of quite a variety of different habitat types. But for the purposes of this tool, those types of habitat are all accessible to each other. So it produces simpler statistics, such as the number of patches of the same habitat type within each of those zones that you see, and also what the total area of those habitat patches are, which arguably is all effective habitat for the species that use it. I'll be interested to see, when I look at the actual data versus elk population, which one is really more closely correlated with the populations. As I mentioned before, CircuitScape will be my tool for looking at connectivity. It's a raster tool that requires a resistant surface, and it simulates electric flow. It doesn't produce statistics, though. What it really produces is a large map like this that shows what the flow is at each pixel. And so I'll be looking for various measures to summarize and otherwise consolidate that data into something that I can use for spatial statistics analysis. And here you can see the eastern part of the county is all this dark blue color, and that's because that's areas that are either highly developed or that have pretty intensive agriculture. And as a result, all the gaps between them are pretty bright because the wildlife has little choice if it's moving across the landscape but to take these paths. And these ones are actually stream valleys. If you go a little bit farther west, this area is the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And there you see kind of a more uniform look of mostly moderate flow. And that doesn't indicate that it's either especially low or especially high resistance to movement. It's that there aren't any areas that are really restricting the movement of the wildlife, except for the highways that you see here and here. So wildlife has its choice of going in really any direction it wants to go, and its movements are going to be determined by other factors as opposed to any particular resistance. As we head west into the mountain region there are some much higher areas of connectivity, and those are really valleys and mountain passes, and the areas that see less movement are much more rugged, topographically speaking. The reason it's overall still pretty high over here is because there's very little human development, so the wildlife is really free to roam as it would like to do. So the data sources I need are going to be actually quite similar for fragmentation and connectivity analysis. Obviously, I'll need data on elk population and movement, and I'll be getting that from the Colorado Parks and Wildlife data sets that they make publicly available. I'll have to ask them, and I already have in fact, for some slightly older data that they don't keep online, but the rest of it's all publicly accessible. To understand land cover, which really drives habitat type, I'm going to use the GAP Landfire National Terrestrial Ecosystems 2011 data set. Now that's based on data that was collected around 2000, so I'm probably going to supplement that with data from the National Land Cover data set. That's going to be updated yet this month, and that should allow me to at least delineate changes in developed areas better. The overall natural habitat types, I'll rely on the GAP data set though. And to understand the roads and trails on a historic basis, I'm going to be looking at the census Tiger Line data, which conveniently gets updated on a regular basis, so I'll be able to do a comparison there. I'll be getting some supplementary information from the Colorado Department of Transportation, and I'll also be getting data from the U.S. Forest Service because they maintain the records of roads and trails that are within the national forests, which are obviously a major part of the landscape. Next, for the connectivity study, I'll also need some slope and topographic position index data. That really is just a measure of the ruggedness, and I'll be using the USGS 3-depth digital elevation data. I'll also need to look at rivers because rivers of sufficient flow volume can impede elk movement, and for that I'll use the USGS National Hydrographic Data Set. The other independent variables I'll be looking at will include human population, hunting pressure, and vegetative health, really what food is available for the elk from year to year. So my results hopefully will answer the research question and give me a better understanding of the correlation of habitat fragmentation and reduced connectivity with the elk population decline. I hope I'll be able to combine those results with a better understanding of the relationship between landscape changes and the other factors that drive population changes. And finally, I hope I'll be in a position to share results with officials at the Forest Service and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, in the hope that they'll be able to use my results to make better management decisions. Thanks for listening. Thanks for, especially those of you on the East Coast, for sitting here so late, and I'm happy to answer any questions. All right, I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Naja, hi Naja, asked, have I looked at declining elk population and disease, like chronic wasting disease? That's a really good question. That hasn't been a real problem in this part of Colorado. In southwestern Colorado, it's a major issue, but it hasn't really hit in this area, thankfully. That's one of the reasons we are concerned about the declining population, though, because it's going to have less resilience then. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that the chat window was blocking before. That's unfortunate. Let's see. The name of the water current software. Yeah, that's CircuitScape. And it is really interesting. It's quite unusual, and is, I think, it's fair to say that it's actually revolutionizing how people look at this kind of connectivity. The natural predators issue is a good one. Really, in Colorado, the only major predator is the mountain lion, and to a much lesser extent, coyotes. And they, in this region, we don't think have a major effect. There's some dispute. They're actually doing a study now, more to southwestern Colorado, where they're actually going to, Colorado Parks and Wildlife is going to kill a bunch of mountain lion and see what that does to elk population. And you can imagine that those of us in conservation don't think that that's the best approach to use. Jennifer has a good question about what kind of statistics do I plan on using to analyze the grid output from CircuitScape? And to that, I would answer, stay tuned. That is something I'm thinking about myself. We're not going to have telemetry data, in this case, unfortunately, unless I'm able to get my hands on some, which I probably won't. Colorado Parks and Wildlife does use some of that data, but they're pretty stingy with letting it out. They want it to be incorporated in papers that their own staff write. So I do have some data. The data you saw, for example, on where elk go seasonally is based on underlying telemetry data along with just visual observations. And so yeah, it's a bit of an art as well as a science to predict those areas. So it's I can't place too much stock in those, and also it's also hard to find consistency over a 20-year period if staff members change. And Ashley, the main tool I'm using for fragmentation statistics is called FragStats, imaginatively, and it's really widely used. It's been around since the 90s, and it's been updated more recently. And there's a lot of argument about the meaning of the different statistics, but it certainly can kind of give you any that you might be interested in. I think I've answered all the questions in the chat. Any other questions? Good question, Rob. The short answer is no, not really. The to the extent that there's data for that, we really wouldn't be adding anything to what the Colorado Parks and Wildlife maps put out. That's one of the reasons why they're not interested in putting out the radio collar data to the degree that we might like. And frankly, people who are regular elk hunters in the region or out-of-state hunters who are likely to be with guides have a really good sense of where the elk are going to be on their own. This isn't really going to add to their knowledge. If anything, their knowledge could be useful additions to what the science is telling us. There is some data on the number of elk killed by vehicles. The issue there is we're never sure exactly what percentage of elk that are killed get reported to the authorities. Obviously, it stays on the highway for a while, but there's also the issue of elk that move off the highway to die, and there is the not insubstantial chance that an opportunistic driver will actually hoist that elk onto the back of their pickup truck and take it along with them. But I agree that is definitely one of the reasons why highways are so resistant to wildlife movement. Although a colleague of mine at work is working on a project where we're going to put in a wildlife crossing near Vail, so that could change over time. Oh, what's my greatest concern in fusing data together from the various sources and different tools? That's a really good question, and I think that's where my statistical analysis is really going to have to be good to look at those all these different factors that are obviously on different scales. And I think a sort of random forest approach where it tries out a lot of different models with all the different possible combination of these data sources is going to be helpful in getting me to sort of narrow it down to what the primary movers are, and then perhaps there'll be an opportunity to delve into those a little more deeply.
I think you have one more question from Layla. Is hoof rot a concern in your area of study?
I'm sorry, is what a concern?
Hoof rot.
Hoof rot. No, that hasn't something that's shown up a lot in this area. There aren't, knock wood, so far, any major health concerns with elk in that area of the state. Again, the Southwest has had a lot more issues with health in the herds, but in the central area, not so much. There's the main, I think, factor there is people like to worry about livestock getting illnesses from the wildlife, but in fact, it's more often goes the other way around, and there's not much livestock in this part of Colorado.
Great. I think that's it for questions. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget to fill in the peer reviews, and also we'll be back online again tomorrow a little bit earlier. But thanks, everybody, for such great presentations, and have a good evening.